This Israel report is brought to you by the Blue Agency. Your Israel property is in good hands. Owning properties in Israel can be a great investment, but challenging to manage if you're based abroad. The Blue Agency will manage every aspect of your property, finding and vetting tenants, maintaining your property and getting it rental ready, negotiating contracts and collecting rentals, reporting back to you regularly. The Blue Agency has built a reputation for trust and confidentiality over 20 years. The Blue Agency, your Israel property is in good hands. Contact us at www.theblueagency.com.
The Israel Report for the latest news and insights with Anthony Reich.
Anthony Reich, good morning. Boker Tov, hope you are well.
Boker Tov, yes, always very interesting around here and getting to an item of news that is away from the main kind of story of the conflict. A very fascinating story coming out of Serbia yesterday is the fact that the remains of Theodor Herzl's grandparents were yesterday exhumed from the Jewish cemetery in Zemun in Serbia, and it's apparently a place not too far from Belgrade. Their remains have been exhumed, and they are going to be buried on Mount Herzl next week, reburied on Mount Herzl next week, alongside their grandson, and alongside their Theodor Herzl's parents, Shimon, Leib, and Rivka. Their remains were actually brought already back in 1949. Theodor Herzl was exhumed along with his parents, and they were brought from Austria, from Vienna, to be buried on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. And now Theodor Herzl's grandparents will be brought to be buried on the family plot, Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. And apparently this was one of Theodor Herzl's final wishes.
I was wondering why this is happening, so that makes sense.
Yeah, he requested that his remains and that those of his parents would be buried along in the Jewish state, assuming there would be one, because of course when he died there was not a Jewish state, so his parents died in 1902 and 1911, and he also died unfortunately before the state was declared, but now along with Theodor Herzl and his parents will also be his grandparents buried on Mount Herzl in the middle of Jerusalem on the family plot. Who would have thought? One wonders what Theodor Herzl would be thinking about this, how he would view this, all of this happening, and against the backdrop of everything that's going on right now. And interestingly, even though there was no Jewish state, in his remains, in his final wishes, he referred to his remains being transferred to Eretz Israel. He had the foresight to know that that's what the country would be called.
Really just incredible. Let's talk about what is going on, because the US has now carried out heavy attacks apparently against Iranian targets overnight. So yesterday, of course, Donald Trump saying he was going to do that. He gave our news team quite a difficult challenge of translating some of his expletives into family appropriate language. Yeah, not easy at all. Anyway, what is going on?
So last night, the attacks that were carried out against targets in Iran were way heavier than anything that we've seen over the last few weeks. Interestingly, yesterday, the Iranians actually initiated an attack against American targets in Jordan. And the Jordanians announced that the incoming threat of missiles and drones had been intercepted. And Israeli authorities, the Israeli security team, also announced that Israel had been active in intercepting those missiles that had been directed towards Jordanian territory. And when I say Jordanian territory, it's really focused on the American presence in Jordan. That was yesterday. And then we also had a drone that attacked a ship, an American-owned oil tanker that was in a port in Egypt. So this is really spreading quite far and wide, now involving Egypt as well. And as a result of those attacks yesterday, a couple of things happened. First of all, the Americans carried out quite a significant attack against Iranian targets actually in Iraq, which was an interesting thing because we see these attacks being carried out against Iraq. And then we understand that, in fact, it's not against Iraq as such, but it just happens to be on Iraqi territory against Iranian targets, Iranian advisors, apparently, members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and technical personnel who happened to be in Iraq, and they were attacked. Obviously, using intelligence to track down exactly where they were. And then last night, the Americans carried out this whole series of attacks against Iranian targets in Iran. Now, of course, this is all happening while Prime Minister Netanyahu is in in Washington, I'm sorry, in the US. And he has been traveling around a little, but basically he's been in Washington for most of the time. And so, of course, the conspiracy theorists will immediately jump into action and say, well, Trump had carried out these attacks for 13 nights in a row, and then he stopped until Netanyahu arrived in America. And then it was all restarted, and not only restarted, but restarted with much more vengeance than was the case before. So the conspiracy would show that, in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu is indeed calling the shots, and he is indeed influencing on President Trump and the US administration's decisions about attacking Iran because they'd stopped. And then when Netanyahu got there, the attacks were renewed. However, I think the reality has little to do with Netanyahu's presence in Washington, and it has much more to do with the Iranian attacks that have been carried out against American targets, particularly in Jordan, but indeed elsewhere as well. And we are just seeing that this morning, following that whole series of American attacks that took place last night, again, Iran has attacked American targets in Jordan this morning. So I don't see this particular round of hostilities ending with last night. It looks as if though this is going to be dragged on. And I think as we continue and Iran somehow manages to withstand these attacks, because they have really withstood some significant attacks against their regime, against physical targets, against their nuclear program, against missile storage, they I think are being more and more emboldened by the fact that they somehow managed to withstand all of this and still come out alive, and still the regime continues to be active and functioning and very much in control, even though we're still not quite sure whether they really do have a supreme leader or not, because even though Mojtaba Khamenei has been elected as the supreme leader, nobody's heard from him or seen him since he was
I saw
elected
something
and
saying that
announced.
he is not even in the country anymore. I mean, assuming he's even alive.
Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, we do understand that he was quite seriously injured, but there's no indication of whether he managed to survive that attack that injured him or not, and whether he's even functioning or not. And as you say, whether he's even anywhere near Iran or not. All of these things are being kept very, very secret indeed. But one thing we can be sure about is that this round of hostilities hasn't ended. And, you know, the other piece of information which came out, which was also of interest, is that apparently China is shipping a whole lot of drones and missiles to Iran, even though the Chinese president had promised President Trump that he would not support Iran in this round of hostilities. And when President Trump yesterday was asked about that, he said, "Oh, I would be very surprised if China is helping Iran after the president promised me that he would not." Well, we all know that international diplomacy doesn't quite work like that, and it's all about interests and what the interests are at any particular moment in time. So it's all quite interesting. And of course, you know, Ukraine gets thrown into the mix here after Ukraine attacked the Iranian ship on the Caspian Sea. Apparently, Iran was considering the possibility of attacking Ukraine directly. So all of this becomes a much, much more regional conflict when you see locations in Egypt being attacked. We see Yemen part of this. We see that Saudi Arabia is being attacked. The Gulf countries we know about, United Arab Emirates. We now see that Jordanian territory is being attacked. So this is becoming very much a regional conflict. And I think it's really important for Israel to whenever this conflict eventually comes to an end, it's important for Israel to somehow make sure that it's at the top of the pile in terms of, how things have ended. Because if things would have ended, for example, soon after the war that we had earlier this year, with Israel very much in the ascendancy and very much in control of things, I could have seen, a new region emerging where Israel is the superpower in the region. Now it kind of doesn't look quite like that, with the Americans having been involved with the conflict in Israel, sitting on the sideline for good reason. And I think it's the right strategy to sit on the sideline for now. But I think at the moment, when everything is over, it's important for Israel to be somewhere in the ascendancy, to be able to be a new leader within this region, which I think that Israel very much could be.
Israel is promoting the idea of an oil pipeline between Saudi Arabia and Israel. How would this actually work?
So it's not a particularly difficult thing to achieve, because there is already an oil pipeline that runs from the port of Ashdod to Eilat. That is already in existence. And so the idea would be to take not from Ashdod, I apologize. Let's start again, from Ashkelon, from Ashkelon to Eilat. And if we would take that pipeline and extend it to the southeast, another 700 kilometers, it would reach the Yanbu oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. That would have to go over Jordanian territory.
Right.
And we're not quite sure whether it would go underwater through the Red Sea, or whether it might go around a land route, which is also a possible solution. But it requires an extension of 700 kilometers, which sounds a lot and is a lot, except that, pipelines like that have been built in the past, and it doesn't seem to be beyond the scope of what is possible. And if that pipeline was built, it would effectively bypass the Straits of Hormuz, so that not only Saudi Arabia, but potentially Gulf countries, the United Arab Emirates and others, would be able to pump their oil away from where it comes from, the origination point, and from where the oil is currently stored, and would be able to get it to the Mediterranean Sea coast, and from there onward to Europe or North America, using the existing infrastructure of that Eilat Ashkelon pipeline. It would be able to bypass the Straits of Hormuz, therefore bypass the current hostilities, bypass the potential tolls that Iran and maybe even Oman might be choosing to place upon ships using the Straits of Hormuz, and potentially make it not only more secure, but even cheaper to do than shipping it from the ports within the Gulf area, the Arabian Gulf, that they currently do. So I think also that would give Israel a very, very critical position in the Middle East, being able to ship the oil out and onward to Europe and the US. I think it's a fascinating plan. I think that it's certainly one that should be explored a lot more. I have little doubt that it'll cost a lot of money to implement it, but it seems that there's a lot of enthusiasm from Saudi Arabia and from the Gulf countries. And maybe that's one of the drivers that is making Saudi Arabia consider the possibility of joining the Abraham Accords, or maybe one of the things, the additional little cherries on the cake that may ultimately cause Saudi Arabia to join. But I think it's a very interesting point, and I think that this is something that would help Israel in its economy and also the oil price significantly.
I think so too, and that would be awesome. On that positive note, that's where we leave it. Anthony Reich, thank you as always. Thank you for another great week of reporting. Wishing you a fantastic weekend, a Shabbat Shalom, and of course we'll catch you Monday morning, 7:45.
That Israel Report was brought to you by the Blue Agency. Your Israel property is in good hands. Owning properties in Israel can be a great investment, but challenging to manage if you're based abroad. The Blue Agency will manage every aspect of your property, finding and vetting tenants, maintaining your property and getting it rental ready, negotiating contracts and collecting rentals, reporting back to you regularly. The Blue Agency has built a reputation for trust and confidentiality over 20 years. The Blue Agency, your Israel property is in good hands. Contact us at www.theblueagency.com.